making you think about some of these issues of the facility that you just drove past on the way in here and how we manage some of that waste looking forward. And then this park that we're about to walk through and enjoy, and what are the interconnections between that ash and this park, and what should we be thinking about, especially as we anticipate this General Assembly. Lawmakers are going to be discussing how to dispose of 15 million tons of ash for the long term. So with that, I think we maybe should just go on into a good viewpoint, good vantage point to get your bearings. So go ahead and begin the hike, and then maybe Jess and I can give you a little bit more of an intro to what work our organizations are doing and what we have found here within Dutch Gap Conservation Area related to the coal ash ponds. Sound okay?
Sounds good.
All right, let's do it. We're doing so well at Jamestown with all the swampy conditions down there, and they weren't necessarily welcomed by the local people either. But this was an old settlement, so they have a little bit of an interpretive center there where you can go and learn more about that history. Behind us here behind me is the James River, and it's kind of a strange shape, right? It goes that way, it goes that way, it goes that way, and it actually goes around to the right as well. The James River originally had sort of an S shape like this, or sometimes it's called an oxbow. We can pass that around actually if you want. During the Civil War, the Union Army started digging a trench. Basically, there was a solid bank right here where I'm pointing. This was all trees, all land straight across. They started digging through here so they could bypass this long river channel and some artillery and have a shorter path to Richmond. So that's why we're sort of left with this confusing maze of channels here. In the early 20th century, the Corps of Engineers did the same thing on the other side here, creating an even longer trench, again, so that it was a shorter path for shipping trade to get to Richmond. So if you look at the map today compared to what we had back then, it's sort of a series of dead ends and sort of just circles. So the original river channel went around this side of Henricus, and today it just dead ends at Chesterfield Power Station. And that's where they discharge their thermal water, so the water that they pull in to cool the plant and use as part of the electrical generation process. They discharge it there, and they also have their ash ponds there. And something you may notice on this map, so that yellow dotted line, that's where the ash ponds sit. So if you think about where the river used to flow and where the ash sits, those are right on top of each other today. So that's sort of an interesting and a little alarming fact in itself. The second map shows places where we have the Southern Environmental Law Center and the James River Association, where we have tested looking at soil and water samples for a few different years. And in each time we found concerning levels of things like arsenic, lead, cobalt, stuff that's associated with coal ash. And we have, again, about 15 million tons of that sitting in two old ponds that are not lined, nothing below them to prevent that stuff from leaking out, getting into groundwater and into surface water. So we have been talking about this issue for about 3 or 4 years, actually. Anybody remember any high-profile incidents that sort of raised our concern in terms of coal ash? Been some recently. Yeah, the Dan River spill.
That blowout of a containment in Tennessee, or
that was
Kentucky?
The big one.
Yeah.
So there was a huge spill at the Tennessee Valley Authority plant, and this was one where a dam, a levee on the side of this pond broke, and it was just sort of a catastrophic breach. So you had a wall of ash that went into the nearby river, and actually you can get on the internet and easily find pictures of houses that are just surrounded by ash that were taken out by this sort of avalanche of ash. That's sort of worst case scenario. We hope that never happens anywhere, but we've seen it happen. And when that spill happened, it sort of kicked off more of a national discussion of what do we do with this stuff. A lot of these plants in Chesterfield and Bremo and Chesapeake, the ones along the James, they were all built a long time ago. Those 3 plants were built in the 1940s, and they've been operating since then. They've got very old burners, and they've been accumulating this ash for that an entire period of time. Once the coal is burnt, the practice has been to mix it with water, flush it down a pipe. It's called sluicing the ash. goes into these unlined ponds. Usually they're right next to the river, and it just sits there. And as the ponds fill up from rainwater or water that happens to wash off the site, they will naturally overflow into the river and discharge that top level of water directly into the river. So that's been happening for several decades. Now we sort of look back and see, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing it this way anymore. You know, we didn't know any better maybe in the 1940s or 1950s, but we have a lot better technology now. We know that this stuff does contain carcinogens, and there's better ways to deal with it. After that spill, after the Dan River spill, we had federal rules that started to be developed and were released in 2015, and that's when we officially started making some of these changes. The Dan River spill sort of forced North Carolina to address it a little quicker. South Carolina is actually way ahead of the game too. They're recycling a lot of their ash. Santee Cooper, their utility there, has been recycling ash, turning it into concrete and useful products like that. In Virginia, we're sort of behind the 8 ball at this point. We have not sort of chosen our path forward. Dominion Energy has proposed capping their ponds and leaving the ash where it is. So that means putting a piece of plastic over top of the ponds after discharging the water, putting a piece of plastic on top of the ponds, putting soil and grass, and then leaving it there, and then monitoring the groundwater in years following that. How does that solution sound to you?
Are these ponds lined?
They're not.
No.
We don't have actually any lined ponds at these facilities that we're really focused on in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is the 3 I mentioned: Chesapeake, Remo, which is above Richmond, here Chesterfield, and then there's another one called Possum Point in Northern Virginia. These are all unlined ponds, and for many decades, DEQ has already asked Dominion to test the groundwater, and there's plenty of evidence that already shows that there's some contaminants in the groundwater, and it's no surprise. It hasn't been sort of pressed here at Chesterfield because the argument is, well, there's nobody drinking the groundwater, so it's okay. We don't need to worry about treating it to drinking water standards. So it's been sort of an unfortunate impasse. The last 3 years, Conservation Community, Sierra Club, James River Association, a host of other organizations has been successful at passing legislation that has prevented closing these ponds with the cap-in-place method, sort of saying, let's wait, let's look at other options for a little bit longer, study different alternatives, and then next year we'll try to find a permanent solution. That's been 2 years in a row we've done that, and we've got some huge studies that Dominion has created as a result of that legislation. This year, Dominion is going after proposals from consultants to get costs at what would it take to recycle all of the ash at Chesterfield, all of the ash at these other facilities. Does that make it more cost effective? Does that make it easier to pull off in a more rapid amount of time so we don't leave this ash here much longer? And we're sort of waiting for that now. November 15th is when we expect those proposals to come in and a report to be issued to the General Assembly. And then we're going to need a lot of help from community members to sort of push our legislators to choose something that's going to really address this problem once and for all. So that was a ton of information. I probably went on longer than I should have, but there's been a lot of sort of background to get us to this point. As I mentioned when we started in the parking lot, I think the goal today is just to kind of get you thinking. Hopefully you have lots of questions as we're hiking around. But this is a beautiful place, and we have over 800 acres of park here that is organized by and preserved by Chesterfield County, and it's intended to be a place where we come out and recreate, enjoy nature. There's a kayaking school in the lagoon where Chesterfield teaches people how to roll their kayaks for whitewater paddling. There's a lot of environmental education that happens out here, and of course we've got I think it's over 200,000 students come to visit this historical site from our elementary schools in the surrounding Richmond region every year. So it's a well-used site. There's a lot of reason that we want to protect it and make sure it's managed well. And so when we're thinking about how we store or how we get rid of this ash over the long term, we really need to consider all those uses. Yeah.
The recycling of the ash, how successful or well tested has that been? I seem to recall some problems that use of it in a particular shopping center in Midlothian cost years ago as part of the foundation.
Yeah. there's a lot of technical aspects to it, and it comes down to sort of the type of ash that you have that you're using and the quantity of ash versus other constituents in concrete. And it can't just be 100% ash, and if it's not done right, it can be problems. I know the issue you're talking about. And I think they didn't really have their quantities quite right, or it might have been the sink swell clay as well in Chesterfield County. But short answer is there are utilities and industries that are doing it and have been doing it for a long time, and it's not a perfect solution by any means. To be frank, it's not really the role of James River Association and for a lot of the conservation groups to say here's the best way to get rid of the ash. Our expertise is the river and how to protect that resource. From what we've gathered so far, though, and what other states are doing, what's been working in South Carolina and North Carolina, excavating it, taking it away from the floodplain, moving it to a lined modern landfill that's going to prevent that stuff from leaking out. That works. It is one of the more expensive alternatives, but it works. And Santee Cooper has been recycling it and generating a valuable product as a result. But there's certainly things to. It's not a perfect solution. I think there's certainly things to keep an eye out for. One other quick thing, unrelated to coal ash, well, sort of related to coal ash, I wanted to share. So we operate a 40-foot pontoon boat that takes middle schoolers out to Presqu'île, which is just a little bit downriver from here. And we do that every fall and every spring. And one of the things that they do with students is they'll trawl for fish. They'll drag a net behind the boat for 5 to 10 minutes, and then the kids get to sift through the fish and count them and identify the species. And we got a new species this week. Anyone want to guess what species it is? The Atlantic sturgeon. So these are an endangered species. These fish were about that large. So they were what you call young of year or almost young of year. They had just hatched and they were migrating downriver. And it's been extremely exciting. It's sort of terrifying because they're an endangered species and you're not supposed to be anywhere near them and you don't want to harm them. But they were they're released safely. We had fortunately trained for that kind of situation, and it's just exciting news. So on the one hand, you've got a river that is showing some really positive signs of coming back. The water quality overall is much improved from decades ago because of a lot of investments that have been made. And we're seeing species like that come back. In 2015, over here in the main river channel where the plant sort of faces, you can't see it from here, but if you're ever in a boat on the river, Chesterfield Power Station is right on the river. There's no space at all. It's right there, and they pull in up to 1 billion gallons of water a day at that intake. In 2015, they also found a couple of those juvenile sturgeon that had just hatched, but unfortunately they were sucked into the plant. And that's a great concern moving forward. Is industries like Chesterfield and other water intakes, they can have a large impact just from using river water on some of the rare and threatened species. So something else to kind of think about as we try to modernize this plant. Again, when you're dealing with a 60, 70-year-old power station, there's sort of a lot of unintended consequences that result from antiquated technology. Started on a good note, and then we kind of down. Sorry. Any questions for me or Jess or anyone? Let's stretch our legs and enjoy ourselves. Just above us here is called the Upper Ash Pond, and this is where the majority of the ash is stored here at the site. So it doesn't look like a pond from here, and actually it's pretty dry on top. There's just a little stormwater pond in there. But again, this is just sort of grass on top of an unlined pile of ash. So rain, groundwater moves through there and is making its way sort of out to the lower elevations here at the lagoon. This is an area where a lot of folks kayak and fish. Right behind us is a groundwater monitoring well. So we're in the park, but you start to see these wells, and you're going to see them all along the path as we move forward. These were added, and he was just telling me he saw when they were being put in. These were added after that federal rule went into place and said, we've got to start looking at closing these sites because we've had a few high-profile spills. And the point of these wells is to look at what is, in a more specific way, what is moving off-site, how is the groundwater being affected. Dominion released the first round of this data in January of this year, and it showed largely what we had already seen in the surface water samples, higher levels of a lot of those constituents. One of the things, though, that they found that we didn't find in our grab samples was radium, high levels of radium in the groundwater, and that's a radioactive element that is also associated with coal. So.
You said that the ponds are unlined, there's the plastic on top, and then the dirt, and then the grass, or whatever.
So everything except for the plastic.
Okay.
Right now there's nothing on there except for a layer of dirt and grass,
Okay.
and they can still periodically add ash to it if they want to.
I see.
But that would be the only difference if they actually kept it here permanently. They just put some plastic on top.
On top, but not.
You need plastic on the bottom.
But it's kind of too late for that.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some other options that have been proposed, and the study Dominion has done in places elsewhere where you can, after the fact, sort of dig these trenches and put in things like slurry walls and barriers to try to prevent that migration. But as you just said, we're sort of after the fact now, where we already see a lot of this stuff contaminating groundwater, and those kinds of options are going to be a little harder to guarantee that there's not leaking happening. We're not really on a mountain here. This is the highest elevation, and if you look at the studies that Dominion's done on their groundwater data, the water moves in all directions. They call it radial groundwater movement, because this is the highest elevation, the pile of coal ash, and the groundwater, what's coming in from the rain and moving out is going out in every direction surrounding us in sort of a circle. Does that make sense?
So this elevation is created by the coal ash.
Yes. Yeah, we're looking at
Yeah, this
a big
coal
pile
ash
of coal
drove
ash.
down under there too.
Yeah.
Are
Probably
they
down under there.
continuing to add coal ash? Are they pretty frequently, or?
So sort of. So they're continuing to burn coal. The plan moving forward is that they take all of their new ash to a modern landfill that has actually been built on site, which is pretty good news.
Okay.
So it's above the floodplain, and it's a place where it's not going to be leaking into the groundwater. So new ash is going there, but the old ash, about 15 million tons, is still sitting in these two ponds.
Sure.
And Dominion hasn't sort of gotten to a final proposal yet, because they've sort of been criticized about their first proposal, just leaving it and capping it. But they could eventually, for instance, move all of their ash from the lower pond to the upper pond. So that could potentially happen.
Okay. Upper
Yeah.
Pond is the one that is built as a landfill, or Upper Pond is this?
Oh,
No, so, and I'm sorry, I'm throwing out these like words as if everyone knows them. I need to get out of my jargon head. But this is what's called the upper pond.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense why it's called that. They apply it kind of randomly. This is the upper pond. The lower pond is where we're going to sort of turn around today, and this one is actually, you saw a little bit of it when you drove in. So it is still full of water, and you can see the ash pretty clearly when you drive by. It was that sort of black substance on your right hand side. That's the lower pond. Because the lower pond is literally low, and if you look at an aerial photo, it's a very narrow strip between the lower pond and the river itself. It would make sense to move it out of there.
Oh, okay.
And so I've heard them propose things like that. Just because if we did have a hurricane or some major storm, the lower pond would be much more at risk than the upper pond, just because of the elevation difference. And I think
But-
you'll see that.
But their proposal is to move it up here with this and just make this one place that they would cap. So it's,
Yeah. And
that's,
it's also
that's what
not-
they've wanted to do, but it isn't. It isn't even as good as what they're doing with the current ash, which in itself is still pretty much on the floodplain, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we still have some ground to cover. I wanted you to know what these things were, because I already was asked as we were walking in. We'll give you some more info. Cue up the policy discussion maybe when we get to our next topic. Maybe you can help me read that. For us, I've been at this spot several times over the last few years. This is an area that we sort of nicknamed Red Cove. And you can kind of see, I know the leaves are blocking some of the view, but you can see there's an exposed mud bank there. We still have low tide. Tide is coming in now. Normally this area all the way out to the mouth of the lagoon is exposed. But you see a difference in sort of the color of the soil between the bank and the middle, so it's kind of red. When you're collecting samples in the field, you just kind of look at the areas around you to describe them and come up with a name. So Red Cove wasn't really, we didn't put a lot of thought into that name. It was just red, but it's sort of stuck. And we've done several samples here, and it's significant because this is the area where we found the highest concentrations of arsenic and lead and cobalt and things that, again, are associated with coal ash and are carcinogen. And the reason it's red like that is because it's full of iron. You know, iron itself isn't necessarily as much of a concern health-wise, but those other things that we're finding intermixed with the coal ash constituents are a concern. So the soil test that we did here, we found as high as 282 milligrams per kilogram, which is, if you look at some of the EPA's recommendations on what is a healthy or safe level of arsenic to have in your residential soil, that's way above that. That's about 400 times higher than the value that's recommended in residential soil. And that's just a recommendation. It's not like a hard standard, but again, it shows that it's something that you want to avoid. It's a human health concern. Same is true for the water sample. We found high levels of that stuff coming out of the ground. I know it's hard to see, and I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to see it exposed at all, so I brought a few photos from summertime when the area is fully the tide's totally out, and so you can see it's bright red, and you can fortunately see that with your own eyes, but you see these sort of channels. See, it's sort of like a darker color going in the middle there. So here's a close-up. So this is flowing water. You can see water when the tide's out. We walked out there right now, you can see it. In fact, water is flowing from that direction out into the lagoon. So this is groundwater flow coming out of that bank right there and seeping directly into the lagoon. If you test out here, right where it's coming out, of course you're going to find really high levels of metals. If you test out there in the lagoon, it's all sort of diluted and gone by them, and it's hard to detect. And also, this area is underwater for most of the day. You have two high tides, 2 low tides a day. And you really only have a couple hours a day to get out here and see this. And sometimes that might be at 2 a.m. or it might be when it's dark outside. So you don't always see this, and you have to be really looking for it. We suspected a few years ago that there were leaks here, and so we came out and we hiked all of these trails, all the public trails, and we went out down into some of these creeks and some of these lagoons, and we tested a really simple thing. We used conductivity, which can indicate whether there's stuff. It could be a lot of different things. Whether there's stuff in the water that are and that's actually what we found, and that's sort of a red flag saying there's other ions in there that are causing the conductivity to change. Things like metals. So that was our first test. We did that at several places around the park, and then we went back and got grab samples, sent them to a certified lab, and then sent those on to DEQ and Dominion to let them know what we found. Here's just another close-up. You can see even kind of a little sheen on there. There's a type of bacteria that likes to eat iron and break down iron, and sort of floating on the surface there, causing that color. But that doesn't look like necessarily what the river should look like over the rain.
Is that sheen caused by the bacteria, or?
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting. I would have always thought that was gas or something.
Yeah.
But
I think the air right here almost has a metallic smell.
Really?
I don't know if anybody else
Smells
notices that.
different.
Really?
It does. It
Yeah.
smells
Some
different.
people have more sensitive smells than others. You can be picking up something there. Well, we'll turn around too. So looking at our map again, we've come from Henricus out here, and we're already all the way up here to number 2. So we've done 2 samples here, 2 different runs. That's what these numbers indicate for 2 different dates. And this is kind of also an interesting spot, because if you look, this is the lower pond right here that I mentioned earlier, and the upper pond is over there. And this is sort of like a little cove that goes up in between the 2. And so it's likely being influenced by both of those ponds. And these arrows are intended to sort of indicate.
and here's the old river, isn't it? This is the original river.
Yeah, so the river dead ends right there. It naturally went through here, through these wetlands that you drove by when you came into the parking lot. So I want to take it just a little bit further. You can actually see, we'll get up to a higher elevation, you can see into the pond a little bit and see what's happening there, and then we'll turn around and start to make our way back. Any questions about anything you've seen? All right, that's good. It's a pretty narrow strip of land that's between the pond and the water, and there it is. You can see how low-lying it is, how close the ponds are. The area where I mentioned earlier, where the hot water comes out from the process plant, is right behind us. It's a little easier to see in the wintertime when the leaves have fallen off, but again, the plant pulls in up to 1 billion gallons of water a day, and they discharge a good percentage of that on this side, much hotter than when they pull it in. So there's a lot happening here. Until fairly recently, when Dominion started the process of closing these ponds, they were discharging that top water over here as well. And that's where we would see those cenospheres I mentioned just floating on the water. You can see some yellow booms over here intended to kind of capture those and prevent them from washing away. So it's, what do you think? Now that you imagine yourself coming here without knowing, what was right next to the park, all those berms and things that you walked by. What do you think now?
Pretty dangerous.
It could be, yeah. I mean, we just had a hurricane hit in North Carolina, and we saw what happened at that Sutton plant. Another breach, another big loss of ash in the river community next to it.
What is the height above average river level? I had thought they were lower. My key brain. So
Lower than what you're seeing now?
yeah, didn't realize they had
Yeah.
such a bank.
It's a good question. I can't tell you exactly.
I guess I'm wondering how
Yeah.
high would the river need to get to breach this year?
Well, we're at low tide right now. That's one thing I can tell you. It will come up a lot higher. You can see the high tide line actually just looking down the road towards Rocky or Fez. That's all going to be underwater. Coming up the edge of the river. So it's probably going to come up another 2 to 3 feet. That's 2 to 3 feet is the average differential between high and low tide. But if we have a storm surge, if we have a big hurricane storm surge, even if a hurricane doesn't hit Virginia, but we have a storm surge coming up, you can easily get a lot higher. We've been lucky to not have a major storm like that hit Virginia in a long time, but this would certainly be at risk. I don't know the exact height in feet, Mike.
And
That's
do you
a good
know how
question.
deep the pond is? Because that's, I mean, we're looking at the top of the pond, and
Yeah.
of course it's got its feet down a lot closer to the water level. So.
Yeah, it's like 20 to 30 feet deep.
Okay, well then
Yeah.
that's.
It might be actually a little deeper than that some parts. There's published maps. It's no secret. If you have the time to dig into Dominion's webpage and look at all the studies that have been done, they have maps of looking at the elevation of the ponds, and there's no question that they are in the groundwater table. The question I had actually was, once they start removing the water, will it ever end? We'll just keep refilling because they're in the groundwater table, and since they haven't gotten to that closure step yet, we haven't really seen that. So this is where I thought it would be a good point to turn around. We've seen sort of the major pieces of the ash pond, and it's starting to rain harder. But we can continue to talk along the way and just stop anytime you have questions. For future reference too, if you do come back to it, this is a pretty unique part. Aside from the ash that's stored right next to it, this trail goes all the way around the outside of this lagoon. It's a complete circuit to take us back to where we started. It's a lot further than just going directly back, but a good place to ride bikes.